When I first moved out to Pine Hollow Lake, I wasn't looking for peace. I was looking for something to hold on to. After 23 years in the military, 3 deployments, and 1 divorce, I wasn't the same man who'd once believed stability came with a picket fence and an HOA newsletter. No. By the time I settled here, I wanted silence water and a place where no one knocked unless they were invited. The cabin came from my grandfather's hands, built back in the 60s, on a sloped patch of wooded land with direct access to the lake. He'd fished these waters swum naked in the moonlight and taught me how to steer a canoe before I knew how to ride a bike. After he passed, the land sat untouched, but I kept paying the property taxes and kept his name on the water rights. I moved in full-time 6 months after my retirement, built a deck, reinforced the foundation, strung up a small solar rig. It wasn't flashy, but it was mine. The lake sat like glass in the early mornings, and the loons came out just after dusk. The only thing that wasn't perfect was the subdivision that had crept up across the hillside over the past 2 decades. Edgewater Estates, an HOA-controlled sprawl that looked more like a corporate colony than a neighborhood. At first, there wasn't much friction. I was technically outside the HOA jurisdiction. My cabin was a legal non-conforming parcel with legacy zoning from before the HOA's incorporation. But I still shared access roads, and the HOA officers never liked what they couldn't control. They'd leave flyers on my truck windshield about community guidelines, even though I wasn't part of their community. I ignored them. Then came Karen. Her real name was Sandra McElroy, but the neighborhood called her Karen for good reason. She had a platinum bob haircut, a clipboard that never left her side, and a voice that somehow sounded both sugary and condescending. When she became HOA president, I didn't think much of it. I didn't vote. I wasn't even invited to the meeting. But the tone of the neighborhood changed fast. Suddenly, there were inspections, notes about aesthetic violations. HOA newsletters started including passive-aggressive lines about non-members setting a poor visual precedent. My woodpile, which I'd stacked the same way for 4 years, was now a fire hazard. My handmade address sign was incompatible with community decor. She even had the gall to question my mailbox placement. Still, I brushed it off. Let them puff their chests. I wasn't on their registry, and the county had confirmed as much in writing. I kept copies in a lockbox, laminated and sealed. Then one afternoon she knocked on my door. She had a manila folder in her hands and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Mr. Rayburn," she said brightly. "May I have a moment of your time?" I opened the screen just enough. "What's the issue?" "Well," she said, glancing behind me at the cabin, "there's been some concern raised about your structure here. A few members have noted that it doesn't meet modern building codes. It might even be unsafe. Have you had it inspected recently?" "I don't need to," I said. "It's grandfathered in." She pursed her lips. "Technically, but the HOA has certain safety standards. I'm not in the HOA. Her smile twitched. "Yes, well, that's a bit murky." "No," I said, stepping out onto the porch. "It's actually crystal clear. Your boundary ends at the access road. This cabin's on a separate parcel. Would you like to see the plat map?" Karen's nails tapped the folder. "No need to be defensive, Mr. Rayburn. We're just trying to ensure a cohesive look and feel for the community." I leaned on the rail. "Karen, this cabin's been here since before you were born. If you think you can regulate my roof color, you're wasting your time." She left without a fight, but I saw the warning in her eyes. The kind that said she wasn't used to being told no. Weeks passed. I noticed her SUV parked at the edge of the woods more often. Once I caught a couple of her board members walking my property line, pointing and whispering. I confronted them, and they pretended to be birdwatching. Then one day, in July, I left for a week to help my old war buddy Tim move into a rehab center in Portland. His legs weren't working the way they used to, and his family needed an extra pair of hands. I trusted the cabin would be fine. I locked everything, set up my trail cams, and left. When I came back, it was gone. I mean gone. The cabin was leveled, reduced to splinters and a charred fire ring. The deck was ripped up. My canoe was shattered. Even the solar panels were gone, as if someone had taken them apart piece by piece. At first I thought fire, but there were no scorch marks, no burn smell, just a yellow notice nailed to the stump of a pine tree near the old porch steps. Structure removed for code violations, HOA enforcement authorized. No signature, no permit, just a seal that said, Edgewater Estates HOA Board of Directors. I stood there for a long time, surrounded by the ruins of my peace. Wind rippled across the lake. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was something deeper. Betrayal, violation, fury. I'd served my country. I'd paid my taxes. I'd lived quietly, never asked for trouble. And this woman, this clipboard tyrant, thought she could erase me with a backhoe and a stapled memo. No, not a chance. I walked back to my truck, opened the glove box, pulled out the sealed folder I'd kept for years, just in case someone forgot where the real lines were drawn. Inside was a signed, notarized water rights agreement from I'm64. And Karen had no idea what she had just started. The following morning, I drove straight to the county recorder's office, the laminated documents tucked under my arm like a loaded rifle. I didn't sleep much. I didn't eat. All I could see was the image of my grandfather's cabin in ruin, its bones scattered like they'd meant nothing to anyone. I needed answers. I needed paper trails. And most of all, I needed to understand how someone with zero jurisdiction managed to demolish a private structure without due process. The clerk behind the counter was a young guy named Felix. He recognized me immediately. "Mr. Rayburn," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Haven't seen you in a while. What can I do for you?" "I need to pull any permits or requests tied to Parcel 19A off Pine Hollow," I said, "especially anything involving demolition." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask questions. After a few minutes tapping keys and scrolling through the system, he frowned. "There's nothing recent. No open permits, no enforcement orders. Last record was a property tax update from 3 years ago. No HOA enforcement notices, nothing filed with the county. Not a thing. If someone tore something down out there, they sure didn't go through the proper channels." I let that sit for a second. Then I took a slow breath and placed the HOA's yellow notice on the counter. They left that nailed to a tree. Felix picked it up and squinted at it. "This has no legal authority. HOA jurisdiction ends at Edgewater's private road. Your lot's separately zoned, not under their covenant. They can't touch it." "Well, they did," I said. I thanked him and drove home in silence, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. I wasn't just angry. Now I was focused. The military had taught me something Karen didn't know: you don't start a war without knowing your enemy. And I had just realized she didn't know a damn thing about mine. Back at the lake, I walked the property. My boots crunched over shards of cedar and splinters of the life I'd built. The garden was gone. The birdhouse my daughter made when she was 8, splintered. Even the metal rain barrel, the one I'd welded shut after a raccoon infestation, was crushed flat like an aluminum can. I knelt beside what was left of the hearthstone fingers brushing moss and ash, then looked out over the lake. It was all still there, still mine. And beneath it, like veins running through bedrock, the old irrigation pipe my grandfather had laid by hand, the one that carried lake water across the ridge to a series of fields that over the years had changed hands a dozen times. Today, those fields belonged to Karen. I remembered seeing the cornfield from the edge of the lake path, neat rows like a stitched blanket draped over the rise. Every morning during the spring, I'd hear the hum of her irrigation pump drawing water through those pipes, my pipes. They were never part of the HOA's infrastructure. The system had been privately engineered decades ago. My grandfather had built it for nearby farmers and retained full control through recorded easement and water rights. Nobody ever thought to change it because nobody knew it still mattered. But it did now. And I still had the original easement agreements, stored in a fireproof box under a false floor in my truck. Later that afternoon, Karen returned. I spotted her white Lexus crawling past the edge of my property line. Her window cracked just enough to peer through like a hawk, circling roadkill. She didn't get out this time. Probably expected the rubble would speak for itself. I stepped out onto what was left of the porch. She rolled down her window. "I hope you understand this was necessary," she called out, as if this were a neighborly errand. "No paperwork, no permits, no notice," I said. "You're trespassing." She scoffed. "As president of the HOA, I'm authorized to—" "You're not authorized to touch private land outside HOA jurisdiction." "That's not me saying it. That's the county." Karen's lips curled tight. "We were acting in the best interest of community safety. You demolished my home." She paused. It wasn't a residence. It was a shack. I stepped off what remained of the porch and walked slowly toward the fence line. "You should leave now, Karen, before this goes somewhere you can't handle." "I'm not afraid of threats." "This isn't a threat," I said, calm as winter. "It's a consequence." She stared at me a beat too long, then shifted into drive and peeled away. That night, I walked the perimeter of the field. The underground valve was exactly where I remembered, half buried beneath a slab of limestone behind a copse of cedar trees. I pried it open and turned the main line counterclockwise twice, until the valve clunked shut with a hollow click. The entire line was now bone dry. Not a drop would pass through. No announcement, no spectacle, just silence. And then I waited. Over the next 3 days, I went about rebuilding my temporary camp. I borrowed a pop-up tent from a buddy at the local VFW hall, set up a cot, a cooler, and a tarp. I had a generator in the back of my truck and plenty of canned food. No one could say I was unprepared. On the 4th day, I heard the unmistakable sputtering of Karen's pump, followed by silence. A day later, her maintenance guy wandered down to the lake. He stood near the shoreline poking around with a metal rod, like he could somehow divine the location of a leak. I watched him from the trees. Eventually, he gave up and drove off. By the end of the week, the front rows of corn had begun to yellow. Karen returned the next morning. This time, she marched down to my gravel driveway like a sheriff in a spaghetti western. "What did you do?" she snapped. "I didn't look up from my coffee." "Morning to you too. Don't play dumb." The water stopped flowing. "My field is dying. The pump's working, but nothing's coming through." "Sounds like a maintenance issue," I said. "Might want to call a plumber." She narrowed her eyes. "You're behind this. You shut it off." I shut off nothing that wasn't mine to begin with. She stared at me, something between rage and confusion churning behind her eyes. "We'll see what the county says." I sipped my coffee. "We will." And we did. 2 days later, I received a letter, certified mail, hand-delivered by a HOA runner who didn't even bother to look me in the eye. The envelope was thick cream-colored, embossed with the gold HOA emblem, like it came from the desk of a governor. Inside was a printed statement full of bureaucratic jargon, claiming that in accordance with community safety guidelines, my structure had been found non-compliant with visual and structural standards and thus eliminated to maintain neighborhood integrity. There was no signature, no contact number, no official stamp from the county or any city enforcement body. Just 5 pages of self-righteous nonsense trying to justify the bulldozing of my life. I didn't rage. Not yet. I walked back to the stump where my porch used to be and sat down on the dry grass. It was strange how quickly something permanent could be reduced to memory. I could still smell the pine walls, see the way morning light used to slip between the slats and paint golden streaks across the floorboards. My daughter had taken her first steps inside that cabin. I'd built that stone fireplace with my own hands, mixing mortar on my knees in the dead of winter. Now, it was all gone. What remained was something more dangerous than anger focus. I went back to my truck, took out the folder, and laid everything out on the tailgate. The original land survey. The water rights deed registered under my grandfather's name, with legal transfer to me. The system layout of the lake-to-field pipe, hand-drawn but notarized back in '73. The pipe itself wasn't just buried metal. It was registered with the county's water district under legacy agricultural use. Karen's cornfields depended entirely on a system she didn't own, one she'd never paid for and clearly never researched. I made copies of everything. I highlighted passages. I drafted a formal complaint against the HOA and sent it via certified mail to the county commissioner's office, the sheriff's department, and the Office of the State Water Resources. Then I waited and watched. Every morning I'd sip my coffee and scan the tree line across the ridge, watching as the green in Karen's fields dimmed to brown. Corn is a thirsty crop. Without water, it wilts fast. By day 5, the inner rows began to curl and sag. I saw sprinklers sputter into silence. Her farmhands mostly hired teens, and a guy named Ernie, who wore the same baseball cap every day, walked around looking dazed, inspecting the ground like they could will moisture back into the soil. That weekend, I drove into town for supplies. At the hardware store, I caught whispers. "Did you hear what happened to Karen's cornfield? Something's wrong with the irrigation. That poor woman, she just planted all that." I kept my mouth shut, but the rumors grew legs. By Tuesday, Karen herself was in full panic mode. She stood at the edge of her property in yoga pants and designer sunglasses, waving her arms as she berated her staff. That night, I heard her pump turn on and off a dozen times, sputtering uselessly. I smiled in the dark. Then came the knock. It was past 9 p.m. The crickets had started to sing, and I was halfway through a can of stew when I heard the crunch of gravel and saw a flashlight flicker through the trees. I stepped outside, keeping my distance. Karen stood there, face-flushed, flashlight in one hand, her phone in the other. "You shut off the water." "No," I said flatly. "I shut off my water." "That line feeds the community irrigation system," she snapped. "No, Karen. That line feeds your cornfield. It always has. It's a private system, and it's legally mine." "That can't be true." "It is." She trembled with fury, her fingers clenching the phone so tight I thought she'd crush it. "I will sue you. The HOA will sue you. You can't just cut off resources to a residential property. It's not residential, it's agricultural. You're not even zoned properly, according to the last update from the county. You tapped into a system you didn't own. You used it for years without permission. And then you demolished the structure that housed the only person keeping it maintained." Karen blinked. I could almost see the realization forming behind her eyes. Her posture faltered, and for a split second she looked scared. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "An apology," I said, "a public one." Her eyes flared. "You think I'm going to admit wrongdoing? That I'll bow to some recluse living in a shed?" "You didn't just wreck my cabin," I said, voice steady. "You disrespected my family, my history, and every legal boundary protecting this land. I don't want vengeance. I want accountability." She turned and stomped away, but I knew the message had landed. The next day, I got a call from the county office. My complaint had reached the right ears. A review board was being assembled. I was asked to present all documentation the following week. I arrived in uniform, not because I wanted pity, but because I wanted presence. The panel consisted of 3 county commissioners, 1 attorney, and a representative from the state's Rural Water Board. Karen showed up in a beige suit, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked like they hadn't read a single line of the case file. I laid everything out: maps, deeds, historical photographs, the original notarized water right, and the lack of demolition permits. I even played a video I'd taken from my trail cam showing a backhoe rolling up my driveway with Edgewater HOA stickers on the side. No county vehicles, no sheriff escort, just HOA volunteers with hard hats and Karen's voice in the background giving instructions. When I finished, the room was dead silent. Karen tried to speak. Her voice cracked. "I thought the cabin was abandoned," she muttered. "It looked unsafe." "And you thought that gave you the right to destroy it?" one commissioner asked. She flailed. There was moldwood rot. He wasn't even living there full time. The rural water rep raised a finger. "Ms. McElroy, were you aware the irrigation system feeding your property was privately owned?" "No," she admitted. But it's been in place for decades. And that makes it yours." She said nothing. The verdict came within a week. Karen was ordered to pay restitution for the destruction of private property and was found liable for unauthorized use of a private water system. The HOA board was placed under formal audit for operating outside their legal scope. And Karen, she was removed as president. But even that wasn't enough for her, because the water was still off, and her fields were still dying. It was almost amusing watching them scramble. Karen had always moved through life like the rules were written around her, not for her. She'd worn authority, like a tailored jacket, expecting everyone to bow under its seams. But now the illusion was fraying, and the more she tried to pull it tight, the faster it came apart. After the hearing, I was approached by a man named Dennis Walters, county surveyor, third-generation native of Pine Hollow, and someone who remembered my grandfather by name. He shook my hand outside the courthouse. "Rayburn, huh? You're Emmett's grandson." "Yes, sir." He nodded, almost wistfully. "Your grandfather was the only reason those early fields didn't dry up in '72. That man knew water better than most of us knew our wives." I smiled politely. He passed it all down. "I've been maintaining the system ever since." "Well," Dennis said, patting the folder under his arm, "I think it's time we made that very clear on paper." He offered to walk the property lines with me, compare current markers with old records, and formally resubmit everything to the updated county plat system just to make sure there'd be no more misunderstandings. We scheduled the survey for the following Thursday. When he arrived, he brought a young assistant and 2 metal detector wands. They scanned the old pipe route, marked points with orange flags, and confirmed what I already knew: the main irrigation trench ran in a perfect curve around the lake's southern bend, passing under a now collapsing wooden bridge, and feeding 2 properties, both of which were now owned by the Edgewater HOA, more specifically by Karen. This was never theirs, Dennis muttered as he traced the line with a gloved finger on his tablet. No transfer documents, no purchase, no usage rights registered with the state. You've got everything locked down legally and historically. And yet they demolished my cabin. Yeah, he said, voice low. Which makes what you're doing now a whole lot more civil than what most folks would have done. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because while the law was slow and clean, nature was already doing its messy part. By the end of August, Karen's cornfield looked like a battlefield. The outer rows were limp-browned and brittle. The intersections had collapsed inward from heat stress. I watched one morning as a team of day laborers tried to run hoses from portable tanks across the field, but it was no use. Corn isn't forgiving. You miss a window and it never comes back. She tried everything. Rented mobile tanks tried drilling a backup well, which was denied due to environmental restrictions, even petitioned the city for emergency water access, but nothing moved. The county had frozen her permits pending the HOA audit. She couldn't even touch the ground without official clearance. And the best part, I never laid a finger on her land. I simply stopped doing her favors. That didn't stop the rumors. Whispers spread like wildfire through Edgewater Estates. Did you hear Karen lost the entire crop? She tore down his cabin, you know, while he was gone. Rayburn, the vet. Yeah, I heard he owns the whole damn shoreline. Truth doesn't need a bullhorn, just space to echo. It wasn't long before a letter arrived at my mailbox, this time handwritten. Mr. Rayburn, I regret the misunderstanding that occurred earlier this summer. Emotions ran high and mistakes were made. I'd like to meet to discuss potential solutions regarding the water issue and see if there's a way forward that benefits us both. Sincerely, Karen McElroy. It was almost laughable. She hadn't called it destruction. She hadn't called it illegal. She called it a misunderstanding. I didn't respond, not with words. Instead, I made another phone call to an old friend named Lisa Kim, who had recently retired from a senior position at the State Department of Water Resources. Lisa and I had gone through ROTC together in the 90s. She now worked part-time consulting on rural infrastructure projects and water preservation cases. She reviewed the full documentation and called me back within a day. Graham, I'll put it bluntly, she said. If you want to convert that water system into a closed loop and register it as a private ecological conservation channel, you'd not only gain full immunity from HOA interference, you could also qualify for state environmental grants. Can I legally shut out everyone else? If you make it an educational nonprofit, say a wildlife education site, or a veterans retreat, yes, you'd be protected under federal and state charter. But you have to do it right. I'll do it right, I said. We began the process that week. I filed paperwork to incorporate Rayburn Watershed Trust, a registered nonprofit dedicated to preserving natural access, teaching kids about rural water systems, and hosting retreats for veterans suffering from PTSD. I'd been wanting to do something meaningful with the land for years. Karen had just given me the push. 2 weeks later, her second letter arrived. Longer this time. Less formal. Still avoiding responsibility. Mr. Rayburn, I understand there have been tensions. I never intended for things to spiral. I acted in what I believed were the community's best interests. I see now that I may have overstepped. Please let's meet. I'm willing to offer financial restitution. I simply want my field to recover. Restitution. Now we were talking. But I wasn't going to sit down across from a woman who bulldozed my life and called it landscaping. Instead, I sent her a single-page response through my attorney, Ms. McElroy. As of this letter, I have entered into legal partnership with the Rayburn Watershed Trust. All inquiries regarding water access, field irrigation, and land rights may be directed to our legal counsel. Any further encroachment or unauthorized action will be treated as trespass and prosecuted under state and federal statute. That was it. No emotion, no room for misinterpretation. She'd declared war, and I had just taken her water, her pride, and her legal ground in one move. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because Karen was desperate now. And desperation makes people sloppy. 3 days after my attorney sent the letter, a rusted white pickup truck pulled onto my property just after sundown. No headlights, no markings, just a slow crawl down the gravel path and a driver who sat behind the wheel too long before getting out. I watched from the shadows of my rebuilt tool shed arms crossed, waiting to see who'd step into the fading light. It was Ernie Karen's longtime maintenance guy. Wore the same oil-stained ball cap every day, always looked like he was halfway between quitting and getting fired. He walked with a limp that suggested a bad knee, and carried a flashlight in one hand, a wrench in the other. I let him reach the edge of the lake trail before I made myself known. "Evening, Ernie," I said calmly. He froze, turned around slow. "Didn't know anyone was here," he mumbled, eyes darting. "You're on private property." "I was just—" Karen asked me to take a look. Said something might be wrong with the water main. I stepped forward just enough for him to see the flashlight clipped to my belt and the laminated sign now hanging from a cedar post. Private Conservation Zone, Rayburn Watershed Trust. No unauthorized entry. "This land is now under federal conservation review," I said. "Tampering with the system is a felony." He raised his hands, flashlight dangling like a white flag. "Hey, I don't want trouble. Just doing what she asked." I didn't even know this was off limits now. "It always was," I replied. "Now it just has teeth." He hesitated. "Listen off the record. She's unraveling. Swearing up and down you sabotaged her. Blaming the HOA board, screaming about lawsuits. Yesterday she fired 2 board members and locked herself in the community center for 3 hours." I said nothing. Ernie sighed, lowered his hands. "Look, I know we've never talked much, but I always respected how you kept to yourself. Never caused issues." She crossed a line. "Everyone sees it now. Then they should have spoken up before my cabin was leveled." He flinched like the words hit him. "Yeah," he said. "I guess we all should have." He turned and left without another word. After he drove off, I checked the valve box. Still sealed. Still secure. But I installed a new lock anyway, and added a motion-triggered trail cam directly above it. Karen might be losing grip, but I wasn't about to let desperation turn into vandalism. The next morning, I got an email from Lisa. "Graham, your application for nonprofit waterway protection is under initial approval. The state's legal team reviewed your documentation and is moving to confirm full land trust status. This means you now have full jurisdiction to deny usage to any private entities not listed as conservation partners. Any attempt to divert water without permission is prosecutable. You may erect signage and fencing as necessary. We'll have a press release drafted next week. Congratulations, Lisa." I printed the email and pinned it to my new workbench wall. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder, this was never about revenge. It was about making sure they could never do it again. That weekend, the town's local newspaper ran a headline that changed everything. "Veteran wins water rights battle after HOA illegally destroys cabin." The article detailed the entire saga: my military service, the cabin's legacy, the illegal demolition, and the court hearings that followed. It painted me as a calm, wronged man who'd simply used the law to reclaim what was his. It didn't mention Karen by name, but everyone knew. I didn't expect the response I got. Letters started arriving, some from neighbors I barely knew, others from veterans groups, even a handful from strangers in nearby counties. People who'd had similar experiences. People who felt powerless. One note, scribbled in careful block letters, simply said, "Thank you for standing up. You didn't just defend your land. You defended all of us." That one stayed in my pocket for days. Karen, meanwhile, went on the offensive. She filed a motion to appeal the HOA audit. She tried to get a temporary permit to reroute water from the public reservoir, but the Environmental Board denied her outright, citing the ongoing investigation. Then she tried something desperate. She requested a meeting with the Rayburn Watershed Trust Board. There was just one problem. I was the board. The letter arrived in a heavy envelope with her real estate firm's letterhead. "Mr. Rayburn, I hereby formally request a sit-down discussion regarding water usage across the southern lake border. I believe we may find a compromise that allows for mutual benefit and resolution of past conflicts. I am prepared to offer a substantial donation to your nonprofit in exchange for limited irrigation access." It was the first time she used the word donation instead of payment. I knew what she was trying to do. She wanted to buy her way back into control. Cloak it in charity. Look good on paper. I responded the next day with a certified letter. Ms. McElroy, the Rayburn Watershed Trust's mission is rooted in conservation, community education, and ethical restoration. We do not sell access. We do not barter with destructive actors. As you are currently under formal audit for misuse of HOA authority and pending restitution orders for illegal property demolition, we see no path forward for collaboration. Your application for irrigation use is denied. Sincerely, G. Rayburn, Director, RAWT. That letter broke something in her. She didn't appear in public for over a week, but her absence was filled by the voices of the community. An emergency HOA meeting was called. Flyers went out, people gathered. Residents who'd once been too afraid or apathetic finally stood up and spoke about the bullying, the fines, the surveillance cameras pointed at their homes, the sudden changes to bylaws without votes, about the woman who tore down a war veteran's home and expected to walk away without consequence. When the vote came down, it was near unanimous. Karen McElroy was permanently removed from any HOA position. Her farm was no longer eligible for any shared resources, and a new temporary leadership board was installed led by a soft-spoken retired teacher named Marla Watkins, who immediately reached out to me for guidance on community restoration. I agreed to speak at their next town hall, not for glory, but because people needed to understand that land has memory and so do the people who live on it. The screams came at dawn. I was standing at the lakeside, coffee in hand, watching the mist peel off the water in soft veils, when it started loud, guttural, and echoing across the basin. Not fear, not pain, just sheer unfiltered rage. Karen. It wasn't the first time I'd heard her yelling across the ridge. She'd thrown tantrums before at landscapers who trimmed her hedges too short, at kids skateboarding down the cul-de-sac, even at her own board members when they dared to question her decrees. But this was different. This was collapse. I didn't go investigate. I didn't need to. I'd already heard from Ernie the day before he'd texted me from a burner number, just a single line. She tried to fire the whole crew. No one showed up today. Corn's rotting. That's when I knew it was over. The last row of crops, the deepest part of her fields, had turned. From yellow to brown to a brittle gray. The plants leaned in on themselves, like skeletons, praying for rain that would never come. It didn't matter what miracle she was waiting for, the water wasn't coming back. She'd spent months posturing, playing queen of the HOA, while building her little empire of rules fines and perfectly symmetrical flower beds. She never thought nature would turn on her. Or more accurately, that nature would obey the law and not her clipboard. That morning, as I sipped from my thermos, the truck from County Agricultural Services pulled up her drive. I recognized the insignia. They weren't here to inspect. They were here to assess damage. Later that day, I learned the truth. Her insurance claim had been denied. She'd tried to list the water shutoff as sabotage by neighbor, but the adjusters found the legal paperwork, my non-profit, the easement records, the water rights going back 50 years. There was no case, no payout, and worse, no backup plan. The bank wasn't far behind. Apparently, Karen had leveraged the cornfield to fund her private renovations. New marble kitchen, Tesla, home sauna. I heard about it all from Marla, the new HOA president, who dropped by with 2 lemon bars and a worried expression. She hasn't been seen in 3 days, she said, brushing crumbs off her lap as we sat by my newly laid foundation. I think she's barricaded herself inside. I nodded, hammer resting across my knees. She'll come out eventually. Marla sighed. I hate what she did to you, Graham. We all do. We let her run wild for too long. But part of me still feels sorry for her. I didn't answer right away. I looked out at the lake, the sun bouncing off the ripples like tiny mirrors. Pity's not the same as forgiveness. No, Marla agreed quietly. It's not. I went back to work that afternoon. The new cabin was coming along slow but steady. I wasn't rebuilding what I'd lost. I was building something stronger, wiser. Everything had a purpose this time. Reinforced foundation, fireproof siding, an open floor plan with space for guests. I plan to host veterans next summer, small retreats for those who needed the kind of silence only a place like this could offer. And I wasn't alone in the effort. People began to show up. An old Army buddy, Travis, drove in from Idaho with a truckload of reclaimed lumber. A couple from the neighborhood brought over tools and offered to help raise the roof beams. Even Felix, the county clerk, who'd first pulled the records, showed up with a cooler full of sandwiches and said, I've never built a damn thing in my life, but I figure I can hold a ladder. By the end of the week, the cabin had walls. By the end of the month, it had a roof. I never once saw Karen, but her absence was everywhere. The HOA newsletter stopped printing for a while. When it returned, it was just a 2-page bulletin about bake sales and water conservation tips. Gone were the fines, the veiled threats, the rules about garage paint colors. People started talking again, like neighbors, like humans. A young couple who'd once kept their heads down now walked their dog across the lakeside trail and waved when they passed. I even caught a teenager sitting by the water one morning, sketching the sunrise on a spiral pad. The silence returned, but not the heavy, suffocating kind. This was a lighter quiet, a healing one. But just when I thought the story was closing, Karen reappeared. I found her standing at the edge of my property one evening, her frame silhouetted against the low light. No clipboard, no sunglasses. Just a woman in a wrinkled blouse and jeans that no longer fit like armor. I stepped outside, slowly resting my hand on the porch beam. She looked up, eyes glassy. I came to say I'm leaving. I didn't respond. They're foreclosing, she said, voice hollow. The corn's unsalvageable. The board won't speak to me. I had to sell the Lexus last week. Still, I said nothing. She took a step forward, then stopped. I was wrong. Finally, I spoke. Yes, you were. I thought power meant control. That I could shape the world around me if I just held tight enough. But you reminded me what power really is. And what's that? She swallowed, letting go. For a moment, I saw not the woman who'd bulldozed my home, but the one who had built her identity out of rules, maybe because she didn't know who she was without them. A queen without a crown, a sheriff without a badge. I nodded. Safe travels, Karen. She looked like she might say more, but instead she turned and walked away. That was the last I ever saw her. But not the last I heard of her. 3 months later, someone told me she'd moved out of state, got a job managing a storage facility. No HOA, no farmland, just rows of quiet boxes. As for me, I stayed. The cabin became a place of laughter again, of healing. I planted a new garden in the front, built benches by the water, and carved my daughter's name into the porch beam, like I had with the first one. And every spring, when the lake mist returns and the loons begin their songs, I walk down to the water's edge, open the valve just enough to let a trickle flow into the reeds, the trees, the wild things, but never again into the fields of someone who mistook kindness for weakness. By the time the county scheduled the formal review hearing against the HOA, word had already spread well beyond our lake's edge. I didn't know half the people who showed up that morning, but they all knew me. Some nodded respectfully when I passed. Others reached out, shook my hand, and whispered versions of the same thing. You stood up for all of us. The hearing was held in the community hall that Karen once ruled like her private courtroom. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The room, usually sterile and silent, buzzed with tension. Folding chairs lined up in rows. A projector screen glowed faintly at the front. There was coffee and awkward greetings, and people looking over their shoulders, half expecting Karen to barge in and seize the mic. She didn't. The state's HOA oversight representative, a no-nonsense woman named Yvonne Castillo, opened the session. This is a formal administrative hearing into the actions of the Edgewater Estates HOA board and its former president, Karen McElroy. We'll be reviewing allegations of unlawful property demolition, overreach, of authority, misuse of community funds, and illegal water access. Her voice didn't waver once. I was asked to speak second after the county's building inspector confirmed that no demolition permits were ever issued. I stood in front of the room with the blueprints of my original cabin in one hand and the deed in the other. For the first few minutes, I spoke like a man testifying. Clear, calm, precise. But then I looked out across that sea of faces. Some fearful, some angry, some just tired, and something in me changed. I started telling the story, not the version on paper, the real one. I told them about the porch, where I used to drink coffee with my daughter, about the little stone path I built during the year I struggled to adapt to civilian life, about the way Karen and her board had slowly escalated their harassment, always just short of illegal, until they crossed that line and didn't think anyone would stop them. And I told them what it felt like to come home to a pile of rubble and find your past erased by a woman with a clipboard. By the time I sat down, the room was silent. Yvonne cleared her throat. Mr. Rayburn, we appreciate your composure and your service. Next came the testimonies from residents. Some I'd never spoken to before. A single mom named Dana, who'd been fined for excessive use of wind chimes. A man named Paul, forced to repaint his front door twice because Karen didn't like the shade of red. A couple who had surveillance cameras aimed at their yard after they spoke up about fee hikes. One by one, the stories added weight. By the time Ernie stepped forward, hat in hand, eyes low, there wasn't much left to say. "She made us feel like prisoners in our own homes," he said, voice shaking, "and we all just let her." The audit committee presented their findings last. Embezzlement of HOA funds verified. Unauthorized surveillance equipment installed with community money confirmed. Illegal demolition confirmed. Unauthorized access and use of a private irrigation system beyond question. The decision was unanimous. Edgewater's entire board was to be dissolved effective immediately. An emergency election would be held. Karen McElroy was permanently banned from serving in any HOA capacity within the state, and she was ordered to pay restitution not only to me, but to a dozen other residents who had quietly suffered under her rule. But what stayed with me wasn't the ruling. It was what came after. As people filed out of the hall, someone stood near the door handing out homemade cookies. I later learned her name was Judy. Karen had once fined her $300 for putting solar lights along her walkway. Now she wore a smile wide enough to light up the whole room. A young man came up and offered to help me rebuild a section of my dock. He'd read the article about the cabin and had been through something similar with an HOA back in Sacramento. "They threatened to take my fence down because it cast a shadow on the president's rose bushes," he said. "But you made people realize we don't have to take it." The most surprising moment came when Marla approached with a clipboard of her own. But this time it wasn't a threat. "We'd like to nominate you as community liaison," she said. "Not for the HOA, just someone the neighborhood trusts, someone who can help keep things grounded." I looked at her, then at the people behind her. The ones smiling, laughing, breathing freely. I took the clipboard. "Only if I never have to issue a fine," I said. She grinned. "Deal." Back at the cabin, construction was nearly complete. The main beams were up. The chimney had been rebuilt, stone by stone. A wooden sign now hung above the doorway. Rayburn Retreat, a place for quiet, for healing, for remembering what matters. Veterans began to reach out. The first group was already scheduled for a spring weekend. We'd fish, build campfires, talk, or not talk if that's what someone needed. Just being there was enough. And as for the water, the line stayed closed. Karen's field was left to weeds, eventually sold at auction. The buyer, a nonprofit that built a wildlife preserve on the land in partnership with the Rayburn Watershed Trust. They planted native grasses, brought in nesting boxes for birds, and let the soil heal. Funny how that works. You take something built on power, fear, and control, and with enough patience, enough light, it becomes something beautiful again. The day the for sale sign went up on Karen's once pristine property, a ripple passed through Edgewater Estates like a sigh of release. The immaculate rows of corn, now dried husks and tangled weeds, stood like a monument to everything she had tried to build and lost. Her white Lexus was long gone. Her manicured yard had turned wild. The hedges she used to trim with obsessive care were now overrun with blackberry vines. I didn't go to watch the moving trucks when they finally came. I didn't have to. The sound carried doors slamming, boxes thudding, a woman's voice snapping orders before falling silent. Instead, I stayed at the lakeside retreat, screwing the final hinge into the cabin's side porch. I'd repurposed some of the beams from the destroyed structure. Not because I was sentimental, but because I believed in the dignity of rebuilding. Every piece that had been torn down by force deserved a second life by choice. Around noon, Marla stopped by with fresh-baked scones and news. "She's gone," she said simply, setting the tin down on my new porch steps. Did she say anything? Not to anyone in the neighborhood. She drove out without a wave, left the front door key in the mailbox. I nodded, wiping dust from my hands. Fitting. Marla hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Her sister called me last week. Said Karen's been diagnosed with hypertension anxiety. Said she's on medication. Moved in with family in Arizona." I said nothing. I wasn't sure what to feel. Relief, closure. Maybe it was just quiet. That night, the lake was still, the moon high. I sat on the porch with a mug of tea and listened to the breeze rustling through the trees. Somewhere across the water, an owl hooted. A loon cried in the distance. These were the sounds I'd built my life around, far more enduring than Karen's barking or the drone of her HOA meetings. But even in her absence, the aftershocks of her reign lingered. At the next HOA town hall, Marla introduced the new community charter. It removed punitive fines, prioritized transparency, re-established a sense of neighborliness that had been smothered under Karen's bureaucracy. I was invited to speak again, this time not as a victim but as a guide. "I'm not here to tell you how to live," I said, standing in front of neighbors who once looked at me with suspicion and now saw me with quiet respect. "I just want to remind you that we're all stewards of something. Land, water, community. These aren't possessions, they're responsibilities." There was a pause, then applause. Afterward, an elderly man approached with tears in his eyes. "She fined me $200 for leaving a birthday banner up too long," he said. "Said it was visual clutter. That banner was for my wife's last birthday before she passed." I put a hand on his shoulder. No one should be made to feel shame for celebrating love. More people came forward, shared stories, apologized for staying silent. One woman handed me a small wooden carving of a heron. "My husband made it before he died. Said you reminded him of someone who doesn't break even when bent." I kept that carving on my desk. As fall settled and the retreat officially opened, the first guests, 2 veterans, and a retired forest ranger arrived with duffel bags and guarded eyes. I greeted them with a handshake, a firm smile, and the promise of space. "You don't owe anyone your story," I told them. "But if you feel like telling it, I'll be here." We spent the weekend hiking the trails, fixing an old canoe, and cooking over an open fire. No group therapy, no forced conversations, just peace, silence, and the sound of life returning to a place that had once been taken. Later that month, I received an envelope without a return address. Inside was a folded sheet of stationery, heavy stock, faint perfume. It was from Karen. "Graham, I don't expect forgiveness. I've spent the last few weeks sitting in a place I used to call home, realizing I never truly understood what it meant. I thought rules would keep people safe. That control meant safety. I see now that I was wrong. You didn't just defend your land. You defended dignity, yours and everyone's. I hope the cabin stands for a long time. I hope the lake heals what I couldn't. Karen." I stared at the note for a long time. Then I folded it back up and placed it in a drawer. Not out of sentiment, but as a reminder that people can change. Sometimes. Winter arrived quietly that year. The first snow dusted the roof like powdered sugar. I chopped wood, sealed the windows, and watched as the lake began to freeze over in slow crystalline waves. And still every week new letters arrived. People wanted to visit the retreat, share stories, offer donations, volunteer. The pain Karen caused had ripple effects, but so did the stand I took. And somehow, I'd become the epicenter of something better. One afternoon, I drove into town and walked into the library. I asked the clerk if they had any books on land stewardship and rural mediation. She looked at me funny. "You planning a career change?" "No," I said with a small smile. "Just want to do it right." Because power isn't control. It's responsibility. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't punishment. It's building something no one can tear down. The first snow didn't last, but it lingered just long enough to remind me how far things had come. 1 year ago, I'd come back from helping a friend expecting to find my cabin, the same one I'd spent my entire retirement dreaming about waiting for me like it always had. Instead, I found sawdust, silence, and a cruel reminder that some people believe a title gives them the right to erase what they don't understand. But now I had something different. Not just walls and beams and a new roof, but something that pulsed stronger than lumber. Purpose. The Rayburn Retreat was no longer an idea. It was alive. The first group of veterans had come and gone with quiet gratitude. A second group had already reserved a weekend in March. Most had PTSD. Some just needed a place without noise. A few never said a word the whole weekend, but none of them left the same as they came. I'd built more than a cabin. I'd built a sanctuary. Every board that went into this place was intentional. The bunk room had handmade beds, each with a reading light and a built-in shelf, because I remembered what it was like to lie awake at night with no one but yourself for company. The kitchen had an open island wide enough for communal meals because food heals in ways doctors can't. And the fireplace I built, that one stone, at a time just like the old one, but this time I set into the mortar a plaque that read, "For the ones who carried weight alone." I still woke up early every morning. Some habits die hard. I'd walk the shoreline trail, coffee in hand, boots crunching on gravel, and I'd check the valve. Still locked. Still mine. The system was maintained, inspected, protected. The state now recognized the Rayburn Watershed Trust as an official ecological corridor protected under 3 layers of law. No one would ever touch that water again without going through me. That thought used to bring me satisfaction. Now it just brought peace. Karen's old fields had changed. The new owners, an environmental nonprofit working with the local university, had begun planting wild grasses and native flowers. They tore out the old irrigation remnants and replaced them with beehive boxes, bird feeders, and tall prairie stalks that waved in the wind like freedom itself. Funny, her fortress of corn was gone, but life had returned. Marla invited me to give a talk at the HOA's spring open house. Not because it was required, but because, as she put it, people trust your voice more than any policy. I didn't write a speech. I just stood under the community gazebo, the same one Karen had once used, to announce new fines for overgrown lawns, and spoke from the heart. I don't want to tell you how to live, I said, but I will tell you this: respect matters more than rules. No HOA document, no bylaw, no title in a ledger gives anyone the right to erase another person's life. We are neighbors, not wardens. And if we forget that if we ever try to control what we don't understand, we lose more than just lawsuits. We lose each other. There was a long silence. Then someone clapped. Then another. Soon the whole crowd stood. And for the first time in years, the HOA hall felt like a neighborhood. The retreat kept growing. A local high school teacher asked if she could bring her students out to learn about water conservation. I said yes. They arrived with clipboards and bright eyes, asked thoughtful questions, picked up trash, and spent 2 hours just sitting by the water sketching the trees. One of them left behind a folded piece of paper taped to my workshop door. It had a drawing of the cabin and a single line written in pencil. I want to grow up and be as calm as this place. That hit me harder than any lawsuit ever could. There were still quiet battles. The HOA still had to fix what Karen broke. The audit uncovered over $60,000 in misappropriated funds. The fines she had imposed, some of them illegal, had to be refunded. Some residents, especially the older ones, didn't trust the board yet, but they were trying. That was enough. One afternoon in early April, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to pick it up. Hello. A pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard in months. Graham, it's Karen. I didn't speak. I'm not calling to ask for anything, she said. I just wanted to say, I read about the retreat, about what you're doing. It's good. It's beautiful. I stayed silent. I don't expect a response, she continued. I just needed to hear myself say it. I'm in Tucson now. I volunteer at a shelter. Small, humble. But it feels right. I let the silence stretch. Then I said quietly, I hope it brings you peace. She breathed in. It's not about peace, Graham. It's about doing something that matters. I see that now. I only wish I hadn't learned it the hard way. She hung up before I could say anything else. I stood there for a long time holding the phone to my ear. Then I went outside, walked down to the edge of the lake, and opened the valve just a little. Let the water trickle down into the marshlands, feeding the new growth, the humming bees, the red-winged blackbirds that had returned to nest. The past didn't vanish. It was there in every scar on my land, in every piece of wood I salvaged and rebuilt. But so was something else. Hope. This place, this land, it had been bruised, yes, but it had not been broken. Neither had I. Spring crept in slow that year, like it was testing the ground to make sure it was safe again. By mid-April, the lake was fully thawed. The loons had returned, their cries echoing across the water at dusk. I'd sit on the porch with my coffee, listening not just to them, but to the stillness that had replaced the war zone my property once felt like. The new cabin stood tall and solid, warmer than the last, and somehow more honest. Not a replica, a rebirth. Every beam held meaning now. Not just wood, but memory. Not just walls, but promises. The veterans kept coming. Some came with duffel bags and unreadable eyes. Others with journals, guitars, or nothing but silence. I never asked for backstories. This wasn't a place for wounds to be poked or labels to be handed out. This was where people could come and just be. They chopped wood. They slept in late. They stood barefoot in the shallow edge of the lake and breathed air that wasn't filled with rules or ranks or expectation. Sometimes they left behind things: a carved coin, a drawing, a dog tag under a stone near the fire pit. I didn't touch any of it. It was theirs to leave. The land knew how to hold secrets better than I did. I hosted a group of teenage boys from a foster program in May. City kids, most of them skeptical, stiff-backed, too proud to admit they were scared of the dark. But by the second night, they were skipping rocks and whispering ghost stories wide-eyed and grinning. One of them, Jamal, asked if the cabin had a name. Rayburn Retreat, I said. He frowned. That sounds official, like a museum or something. I laughed. Got a better one. He thought for a long moment, kicking at the dirt. How about the reboot, he said. Like you come here to restart. That one stuck. I carved it into a wooden sign that now hangs under the main one. The reboot, a place to begin again. It was mid-June when I received the final letter from the county. The lawsuit was closed. Karen had settled quietly, just as she had slipped away. The restitution payments were distributed. My original property rights had been affirmed, stamped, sealed. And the HOA charter, rewritten from the ground up with full transparency, democratic oversight, and zero tolerance for abuse of power. Edgewater Estates wasn't perfect, but it was healing. People planted new gardens. Kids played in yards without worrying about Karen's surveillance cameras tracking their sidewalk chalk. The sidewalk chalk, in fact, became symbolic. One afternoon, I passed a driveway where a little girl had drawn a rainbow with the words, "Welcome to the neighborhood," under it. Her father stood nearby with a rake. We nodded at each other, a quiet kind of agreement passing between us. Later that day, I opened a letter from a woman named Judith, a former HOA board member under Karen, who had once voted to fine me over a firewood stacking violation. Her letter was shorthand written and almost embarrassed. Mr. Rayburn, I was wrong. I followed out of fear, not conviction. But I watched what you built. I watched what you endured. And it taught me something I'll never forget. Thank you for reminding us what leadership looks like. Sincerely, Judith R. I pinned it next to the kids' lake sketch, next to Karen's letter, next to the folded note from the girl who named the cabin. Because healing doesn't come from revenge. It comes from remembering. One morning, I stood knee-deep in the lake checking the pipe system after a heavy rain. The water was colder than usual, but it was clear, so clear I could see my reflection between the ripples. Not the hard-set jaw of a man in combat, not the stiff frame of a veteran trying to adjust to civilian life. Just me. Older, weathered, but whole. That afternoon, I hosted a small ceremony. Nothing formal, just a gathering of 20 or so. Friends, neighbors, and guests. We lit a fire, shared bread, and spoke softly about what this place had become. Marla read a short poem about letting go of control. Travis, the one who brought the reclaimed lumber, told a joke about how many veterans it takes to fix a screen door. The punchline didn't matter. It made us all laugh. As the sun dipped low, painting the lake in hues of gold and violet, I stood and looked at the people around me. No HOA titles, no battles, just humans. I raised a glass to land that remembers, to water that flows freely, and to people who learn, rebuild, and grow. We drank, and when the fire turned to embers, we sat in that silence, no longer empty but full. That night before bed, I stood at the window and looked out over the lake one last time. The cabin was quiet behind me, the logs crackling low in the hearth. On the table was a list of future guests, a care package from a neighbor, and a letter from a local school asking to schedule another visit. And I thought of my grandfather. I thought of the man who had laid the first pipe, who taught me that the lake isn't something you own, it's something you respect. And I knew that if he were here, he wouldn't say much. But he'd nod, just once. That would be enough. I turned off the light, let the silence settle in again, and went to bed. Finally, after everything, there was nothing left to fight for, only something to protect. And that too was peace.